and thank you for your patience while we dealt with the technology. I'm going to introduce, we'll introduce ourselves really briefly, and then we have all agreed that we would talk about 10 to 12 minutes among ourselves, and then open this up to a broader conversation in hopes that this can be really an opportunity to learn and talk quite a bit more. So my name is Kristi Barnwell. I am an associate professor in the history department, specializing in modern Middle East. I published on U.S. Jordanian relations regarding various conflicts in the past with Palestine, and I also specialize in imperialism and nationalist movements in the Middle East broadly.
Hi, everybody. My name is Richard Gilman-Opalsky, and I'm a professor of political theory and philosophy in the School of Politics and International Affairs. I focus in political theory and philosophy, but one of my areas is in post-colonial theory, colonization, decolonization in the 20th century.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nizamuddin. I teach the politics at SPIA School of Politics and International Affairs. I've been here since 2007. It's an honor to be with you. I mostly teach international courses.
So the way that we're going to do this is I will speak briefly to sort of give you a sense of what has been happening in the last year. I think Ali will go next to speak about sort of the international relations and sort of the broader regional crisis. And then Dr. Richard Gilman-Opalsky will give a discussion. You're mainly going to focus on campus protest and sort of general protest, I believe. Yeah, but revolution and liberation and those kinds of things, generally speaking. So I'm going to try and touch in my brief time on 3 topics. The first of these is an overview of some of the tremendous losses of the last year. Then I'm going to turn to a very brief discussion of human rights and U.S. complicity in the genocide. And then I want to offer some reflections on teaching history and the culture of the Middle East in this moment. Before I start on this first part, I want to give a bit of a content warning. I'm not going to try and go into too many graphic details, but we are talking about graphic details. So just be aware of that. So what we know and what we don't know about the last year. More than 42,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. The official number as of this morning I checked was 42,010. This does not, however, capture the totality of death. This is the number of people who have been partially or fully identified and registered by the health ministry. But since the early spring, most of the hospitals have not had the capacity to check and cross-check identification information. So this does not include the people who are missing and presumed dead under the rubble of buildings, those who have died in Israeli custody and have not been returned. It does not count the 80 to 90 unidentified bodies Israel dropped by truck in varying states of decay in August. Yaman Abu Suleiman of the Gaza Civil Defense told the Associated French Press, "We received 80 bodies inside 15 bags, with more than 4 martyrs in each bag wrapped in a single shroud. This doesn't count those killed in fires so hot their bodies were fused together in the Tel al-Sultan massacre in June, or in the bomb crater at al-Muwasi on the southern coast of Gaza in September, when at least, quote, 22 people are reported missing, assumed to have been vaporized by the intensity of the blast." In July, late June, early July, researchers published a conservative estimate of the then expected deaths in excess of the war, if the war stopped then. And they estimated that around 186,000 deaths would occur from the war based on disease, famine, complications from injuries. And since then, we have tried to extrapolate given the operations and the continuation of things. And there have been estimates like the deaths could be more than 4 times the official count. It gets harder and harder to estimate and to determine what's going on as hospitals go out of operation and municipal buildings that house records and track data are destroyed and emptied. This doesn't include the 721 Palestinians killed in the West Bank and the 1,000 Palestinians killed in Israel. I learned the word scholasticide this year, the erasure of a people through the elimination of schools, universities, and educators. Every university has been bombed or damaged beyond use, and the schools in Gaza are closed. either damaged or converted to shelters for displaced Palestinians, and which are frequently under the threat of evacuation or military action. More than 70% of all the mosques have been significantly damaged or destroyed. This includes the 1,400-year-old Omri Mosque in Old Gaza City. The third oldest church in the world is the Church of St. Porphyrius, which has been bombed multiple times, most recently in August. Before October 2023, the average number of aid trucks into Gaza was 500 per workday. According to UN news reports, approximately 877 aid trucks made it into Gaza for the entire month of September. In North Gaza, which is currently under a total siege, no aid trucks have entered since October 1st. For the first time in 25 years, a case of polio was reported in Gaza. It had been essentially eradicated. It's a disease that causes paralysis, significant disability, chronic illness, and suffocation through the weakening of musculature that makes your lungs function. Rapid efforts to vaccinate as many children as possible were underway in September, and they started a second round, or were about to start a second round of vaccinations that was just getting underway. But Monday, the vaccination site in Nusayrat was bombed and 22 people were killed. 595 healthcare workers were killed in Gaza and the West Bank. 128 journalists have been killed, and news offices have been shut down or censored in Israel and the West Bank. 902 entire families have been erased from the civil registry in Gaza. 1,364 Palestinians were left as the sole surviving members of their family, and 3,472 Palestinian families were reduced to family members. In the West Bank, in late June, Israel declared a seizure of more than 3,000 acres of West Bank land in the largest land seizure in decades. And illegal Israeli settlers have been forcing a terror campaign in the West Bank with IDF passive and active support. In September, a video was released of settlers beating a teacher in a Palestinian school and they then tried to break into locked classrooms of students. The UN has documented approximately 1,400 settler attacks in the past year, not including harassment and threats. And the Israeli forces have regularly attacked and besieged the city of Jenin in the northern part of the West Bank since August of last year, and destroyed 70% of the city, ripping up streets and damaging sewer and water lines. Where are we in this moment? And in regards to the international community, what role does it and the American government play in contributing to the ongoing genocide? For months, Israel used the excuse that Hamas was using human shields to justify civilian deaths as collateral damage and targeted operations. This is increasingly being recognized for the war crime it is, for the violation of international law that it is. More than half of those killed to date in Gaza are children who cannot be understood to be combatants. And Israel's a responsibility under international law to minimize civilian death. The International Court of Justice heard oral arguments regarding the probability of genocide in Gaza on January 10th and 11th, and issued its first rulings with a 15-2 and 16-1 vote ruling, where the judges voted that Israel's operations in January constituted a plausible case of genocide and called for Israel to take any and all actions to prevent genocidal acts. Only the judge from Uganda and the ad hoc judge from Israel voted no on any parts of the ruling. In May, the court again issued additional rulings calling for provisional measures to be put in place to prevent genocide. The UN Security Council has failed to enforce the rulings to date. Additional war crimes and human rights violations include extensive use of sexual violence against Palestinians in Israeli custody. In one case, Israeli soldiers were caught on camera sexually assaulting a male Palestinian detainee. The detainee was subsequently hospitalized with extensive injuries and may have been paralyzed as a result of the attack. Israel detained 10 soldiers, but released them following large public protests against their being detained, with public discourse focusing on the crime of leaking the video and not the attack itself. And Ben-Gvir, the security minister, saying that any action, including this, was permissible if undertaken for the security of the state. The use of Palestinians as human shields. Footage, let me Footage of a Palestinian strapped to an Israeli military vehicle while driving through a destroyed neighborhood in Gaza was released this summer in June. Social media reports as early as November talked about Israeli soldiers on social media demonstrating them participating in probable war crimes, the wanton destruction of buildings, the rifling through personal property, the abuse of corpse and live prisoners, and more. The U.S. government continues to supply weapons without pause and has sent over $100 billion in weapons and military aid since October, while state and local governments have invested millions of local tax dollars in Israeli government bonds as a show of support to the state. The U.S. State Department and the Biden-Harris administration continue to proclaim unconditional support for Israel's right to defend itself. Frankly, I don't see anything defensive about the persistent, aggressive, expansionist campaigns in Gaza, the West Bank, and now South Lebanon. There is no enforcement of international law through the UN and UN Security Council, where the U.S. has persistently vetoed actionable resolutions, and there's been no enforcement of American laws like the Leahy laws that prohibit providing military aid to countries violating human rights and international law. Finally, I want to reflect on my role as a historian and scholar trying to teach in this moment. I'm a human being whose friends are being impacted by this and who is having to watch this material and track it to be able to talk about it. And I have learned that I have to make choices between telling truths or providing a somehow balanced and multifaceted perspective that allows people to consume information that they perceive to be objective. But telling truths with facts is incompatible with the both siding perspectives people want to hear. So they can hold on to the idea that this is far too complicated to understand, and so that you can ignore what's happening and wait to find out what happened later. I cannot, for example, tell you that settlers are paying to take boat tours off the coast to watch the genocide of Gaza and plan for settlements they will build without somehow people presuming that this is an exaggeration or a fringe movement. When the deputy speaker of the Knesset calls for Israel's military to burn Gaza to the ground, and those holding central posts in the Israeli cabinet are leaders from these settler movements, like the national security minister and the minister for finance. And even when someone like Yoav Gallant, who the US media sometimes presents as a partner, makes statements like, "We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly."
This is the first time that I've ever served with City for 17 years. I have fallen in love with them, not because of their scholarship or their personality, the parts that they possess. And Dr. Barnwell has asked me to incorporate an Islamic perspective on this topic. So I'll just share one aphorism and then develop upon it. So the aphorism is that, or the axiom is that, faith shall not rest in a person until the heart settles. So faith shall not rest in a person until the heart settles, and the heart shall not settle until the tongue settles. Heart shall not settle until the tongue settles. So from the Abrahamic perspective, all of us contain something very spiritual within us. It is the divine breath of God that we carry within us. At the same time, we have a physical essence that relishes in certain sensual pleasure. So both the spiritual self and the physical self occupy the same space, namely our body. And we need to give each its due rights. So the spiritual self needs sustenance, and so does the physical self. The spiritual self, if you emphasize or overemphasize the spiritual essence, then you violate the rights of created beings. But if you delve into or indulge in the physical self and only prioritize it, then that can lead to hedonism, indulgences. So both need to exist in a balance. And the heart shall not settle until the tongue settles. But essentially, we are at our core, at our essence, souls with bodies and not bodies with souls. From the Islamic and Abrahamic perspectives, we are souls with bodies and not bodies with souls. However, as a result of our wrongdoing, we are taught that stains develop on our spiritual heart until it spreads and we become accustomed to it. So for example, somebody who executes prisoners for a living. The first time he does that, he may be sickened by the disgusting fact that he took somebody's life. But over the course of time, and having repeated that act, the person gets used to it. And the person gets used to it, and it becomes routine. And likewise, soldiers also need to be taught how to kill until killing becomes routine. Now, coming back to the heart and the tongue that is connected, it is said that the heart and the tongue are like a bowl and a spoon. So the heart is a bowl, and that which comes from the lips is the spoon. And the heart only spills that which it contains. So consider some of the rhetoric on both sides. So the leader of Iran has said that Israel is a satanic country, a satanic regime. The leader of Hamas said that we are forces of light and Zionism is a forces of darkness. But the rhetoric and the language on the other side is astronomically worse. So as Dr. Barnwell just mentioned, we are fighting human animals. Naftali Bennett said that everyone in Gaza is a potential victim because they voted for Hamas. The Prime Minister of Israel said that we are fighting Amalekites. Amalekites were people who were put to death. Every man, woman, and child, every ox and sheep was put to death. Routinely, thinning the herd is invoked. The heritage minister said that we should use nuclear weapons in Gaza, nuclear weapons. And one of the other ministers said that we should turn Gaza into Auschwitz. So I would like to suggest to you that the real tragedy in this is not just physical, but spiritual and psychological that will fester for generations to come. Because the dehumanization and devalue of human life will continue even after Gaza is rebuilt. And Gaza will be rebuilt on the corpses of Palestinian children. But this hatred will fester. So Israel felt that it was the victim on October 7th, rightfully so. However, the bloodlust that has happened since has caused the oppressed to become the oppressor. It's very uncomfortable for me to quote any philosopher when I have a giant next to me, really, right? My favorite line in Socrates is that worse than the oppressed is the oppressor, for while the oppressed has lost his body, the oppressor has lost his soul. While the oppressed has lost his body, the oppressor has lost his soul. Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's famous novel. Part of the punishment is having delivered the crime. So once Prophet Muhammad taught his disciples that do not be people of inaction, such that if somebody is kind to you, that you are kind to them. Instead, if somebody is good to you, be even more exemplary in your goodness to them. And if they oppress you, resist them, do not oppress them. In essence, don't become the object of your hatred. So, did Hamas violate this core precept on October 7th? Absolutely. Setting aside all of the lies and the propaganda of the things that happened, which clearly have been debunked. But let's just say some of those things happened. Is that in violation of this core precept? Absolutely. But how a person reacts depends on every person. So, Ehud Barak, who served as a general in the IDF and a prime minister, said that if he were Palestinian, he would become a militant and a terrorist. So my father's favorite author and poet was Ghalib, who documented what happened in 1857 in India, where there was a specific village that was very effective in fighting the British. That entire village was torched to the ground. And so the Britishers were actually taking women and children as hostages, maybe perhaps raping them, I'm not sure. One mother took life into her own hands. She had a daughter, a teenage daughter, that she poisoned her and then consumed the poison. Now, everybody did not react in that way. Let's just say 10 people reacted in that way. 100 people reacted in that way. I am disgusted at a mother that takes the life of her daughter. But I am even more disgusted at the circumstances that prompted her to do so. Both can coexist in my heart. So a thought came to my mind that I wanted to share with you last night while I was preparing my remarks. And since we started with the heart and the tongue, let me finish with the heart and the tongue. So let's just say, and I'm going to pose a question to you at the end. Let's say that there's a group of people, let's call them Jews. Jews are the oppressed people. And let's say that there is a group of people called the Palestinians. Palestinians are the oppressors. So people who are Jews are being oppressed by the Palestinians. Separate laws are established for Jews. Their houses are usurped. Palestinian militias and settlers go into Jewish homes and kill them. The Palestinians are supported by a powerful army with sophisticated weapons, mostly from the US. And as a result of this oppression, certain Jews resist this prison camp and break out and commit atrocities and violence. As a result, in retaliation, the Palestinians go on a killing spree of Jews. They kill them, starve them to death, block any aid, target synagogues and churches and hospitals, grids, sewages, and make a life a living hell for the Jews. And proceed to drop 200 million pounds of bomb in an area the size of Philadelphia. There is a hospital, let's call this Mount Sinai Hospital. Let's not call it Ashifa Hospital. 500 of healthcare workers are taken by the Palestinians, Jewish healthcare workers, taken to a place tortured. The director of that hospital, of Mount Sinai Hospital, the Jewish director, is forced to strip in his underwear and then forced to consume something, namely dog crap. There is a beautiful girl whose name is Hind Rajab, but let's replace Hind Rajab with Anne Frank. She's a beautiful girl. She's trying to flee her situation. Her entire family is killed. And an ambulance is sent to rescue Anne Frank. That ambulance is blown up. And then Anne Frank is killed as well. Human Rights Watch observes that 355 holes were in the car that Anne Frank was in. So in this presence of such inhumanity, such savagery, such brutality, what would you say? Would you say that the innocent Jews that have died are just collateral damages and that Palestine has a right to defend itself? Or would you call this a Holocaust? And if you call this a Holocaust, rightfully so, then why is it different if the victims are someone else? 7 workers from World Central Kitchen died, and there was discussion that we should stop aid to Israel. And we've already accepted that some life is more precious than another. So what emanates from your lips, what you would say, is reflective of the hearts that we
I don't have a eloquent presentation plan. I just have some notes and I'm going to improvise, largely in response to what my dear colleagues have said. Following what Ali has just said in this kind of thought experiment, I would draw our attention to some historical facts about Hamas and Hezbollah, because we're also talking about a larger regional conflict now. That's one of the major developments of the past several months. First of all, in 2006, Hamas received 44% of the vote in Gaza. Ehud Barak, who was prime minister and a general in the IDF, who Ali mentioned, he has said, an Israeli, he has said that Hezbollah was created by Israel when Israel waged its war in Lebanon in 1982. Those are his words. That it was so one thing that I would point out, which is very controversial to say, but it doesn't make it any less true, is that these organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, these are resistance organizations. That is a fact. That doesn't mean we have to like everything they do. I understand and appreciate Ali's perspective on that. But, you know, in political theory and when I teach the 20th century politics, I often criticize Stalin and Stalinism. I mean, I think as a philosophy, it's about as impoverished as it gets. But the fact is that Hitler wanted to attack what he considered the Jewish scum Bolsheviki in Russia. And Stalin's Red Army was a major part of that resistance to the spread of Hitlerism. Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt were very grateful about the Red Army. This is not to endorse Stalinism or to endorse the acts of Hezbollah and Hamas on October 7th, but you have to understand that when you're talking about an occupation that stretches back many decades, what we know from the 20th century history of decolonization struggles is that resistance is inevitable. It always happens, but it takes different forms. This is the case, right? It always happens, it takes different forms. You know, so in Algeria, when Ben Mahidi was captured, and they said, why do you send your women into crowded city centers with handbaskets full of bombs? Mahidi said, give us your bombers and we'll give you our handbaskets. One question is, if we're really upset and worried about violence, if we really are concerned about violence and the loss of precious life, whether it's in Tel Aviv or in Gaza, you cannot look only at, you cannot treat human life as if it's not of equal moral worth. This I think we all agree with up here. A couple of things about this year. The ICJ, excuse me, has, as Dr. Barnwell said, with very few exceptions, called what Israel's been doing in Gaza a plausible genocide. IDF is now in the International Criminal Court. Before October 7th, you've had decades of occupation. Now, there's a lot of different scholarly assessments of what that was and what that looked like. So some people, and I don't totally agree with this, I'm just going to tell you what some scholars say. They describe Gaza as a concentration camp. So actually, Dr. Nizamuddin's story has a long history of actually being confirmed as Gaza as a concentration camp by Jews. UN official in 1955, not a decade after Israel was established, E.L.M. Burns described Gaza in 1955 as a concentration camp, his words. Senator Gore, Al Gore's father, visited Gaza and in 1967 said, it's a concentration camp, what he was just visiting. Giora Island in 2004, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, described Gaza as a concentration camp. These are not like descriptions that make you think of a concentration camp. These are the words that pass through the lips. It is a concentration camp. In 2002, Baruch Kimmerling, an Israeli academic, described Gaza as a concentration camp. The Israeli journalist Amiri Haas in 2019 described it as a concentration camp. Now, I think when I read, I learn a lot from a scholar of the region. We have one right here, but also Rashid Khalidi, who's at Columbia University. He's talked about how wouldn't call it so much a concentration camp, that rather it's an occupation, many decades long occupation, and he described it more as a Bantustan. So Bantustan is the territory during South African apartheid that was set aside for blacks to live in during South African apartheid. I mean, when we talk about scholars of this region, it doesn't mean that we agree with everything they say, but I find this convincing. It seems to me that Gaza is closer to a Bantustan than a concentration camp. But the point being, is in some ways, the same. That resistance emerges. Okay, it's not, if you look at other locations where foreign powers control borders, they control what goes in and what goes out, who is able to come in and out, water and electricity and the internet. Resistance emerges. And the stupidity of the current Israeli policy that's been ongoing now in this intense phase, to think that this would diminish resistance moving forward, is not lost on many people in Israel. Netanyahu has been met with protests for years by Israelis in Tel Aviv. They stopped for a while after October 7th. They're back now. I want to be clear. These protesters against Netanyahu in Israel are not pro-Palestinian, not at all. But they oppose, in fact, what they often say when they're interviewed is you would be surprised maybe that they protest Netanyahu, but they understand that the policy of Netanyahu is not good for purposes of getting hostages back. It's not good for the purposes of diminishing hostilities. It's not good for Israelis in the long haul. So many other things that could be said, of course, and we want to leave time for comments and questions, but it's difficult for me as someone who studies global uprisings and social movements, and who looks at histories of decolonization and looks at it through the lens of post-colonial theory. It's difficult for me to see hope in Gaza. If you look at the material conditions of life on the ground in Gaza over the last year, the idea that the people living there could somehow mobilize new resistance movements that are, capable of some kind of emancipatory project of decolonization, it's very difficult to take that seriously. It seems impossible. If you just look at the material conditions of life. That's bad. Then you would say, as a political scientist, well, what about the international state actors? How can different governments go in to bring about a ceasefire, to change the relations of the conflict? The United States would be the obvious actor, but total impunity for Netanyahu in Israel. Red carpet rolled out for Netanyahu not long ago here inside of the United States. And it is, in fact, the case, if you, as Dr. Barnwell also mentioned, that both parties in the United States are lockstep in agreement on an ironclad policy in the region. So there's really no hope from the ground up in the sort of conventional politics of emancipatory struggle. It's not very clear to me that even if the ICC comes into agreement with the ICJ, that will make any, this genocide is being live streamed. This is a genocide that is being well documented. You can look at some of the work that Mehdi Hassan has done in terms of looking at it from the perspective of Israelis and Israeli culture, and with total impunity. So here's where I would like to end with some hope. Okay, just a tiny bit, because sometimes it's hope in hopeless times doesn't start big. Sometimes hope in hopeless times is a small spark, and then the question is, where does it go from there? How does it grow? There is a lot of criticism of Netanyahu, a lot of new understanding that it's not just anti-Semitism that is directed against Netanyahu, it's people who are concerned with right-wing racist politics. This is more prominent now than at any point in my life. I have never seen so much open discussion directed at what's going on right now in a critical way, taking aim at Netanyahu and this policy in Gaza. Public opinion, I do think, is turning also inside of Israel. I think globally you're seeing a lot of calls for ceasefires, students, encampments. Those were remarkable last year, the student encampments. These are young people who are rising up against what's been going on over the past year. They do understand, of course, that the United States government is funding the Israeli military, and the bombs that are being dropped are paid for by the United States. But it's also a fact that this isn't happening in the United States. right? They're talking about another government far away and other people far away. And I think that's always a good sign if you are, like me, a humanist, which is to say that you care about, you think about the equal moral worth of human beings just on the basis of their equal and shared humanity. Also, as somebody who was born and raised in a Jewish family, I was alienated from that Jewish identity almost entirely by the position of American Jews on Israel. It was quickly taught to me as a young person who went to Hebrew school, and I asked very questions that I'm sure would sound stupid to me now, but the answers were worse than the questions. The answers were terrible. And so I was alienated from it. But what we are seeing now is growing numbers of Jewish people who are standing up and saying, not in our name. Criticism of the Israeli government is not anti-Semitic. If you're interested in looking at it, you can look at Jewish Voice for Peace and what they have been doing over the last year. This gives me hope. And one thing that is the same in terms of emancipatory struggles all around the world now and then is that hope doesn't come from the states, the governments, the heads of state. It usually starts from the bottom and moves up from there. So I think we've said more than enough. And then the plan was to invite comments and questions from the room.
Yeah, I would first of all want to thank you so much for this event. Overall, I think as a students, we're really looking forward for having events like that. Have faculty when they present and give their perspective on a lot of questions. So much appreciated if we got events like that more often. But I'll jump to the question. You know, we're getting closer to the election in the United States, and citizens will decide who will be their president. With that being said, both presidential candidates show their support to the Israel. That's, I think, is clear. However, both candidates have kind of different vision on how to resolve this conflict. Excuse me. And my question is, how impactful those elections going to be for the Middle East and security situation in the globe overall, specifically this election? Thank you.
I guess I will say that all my life, there is no, oh, yes. So the question was, what is the impact of the elections, given the two main candidates, both in some way, shape, or form, continue to support Israel, and on the other side of this election, even though they have different plans, what's next? And I think more than anything, it makes it eminently clear that no matter what happens at the next election, the day after, there's still work to be done. There is no satisfactory answer for any of the two main candidates as far as Israel is concerned, as far as Palestine is concerned. There's been some rumbling about the latest letter that was leaked from the Biden-Harris administration regarding whether or not if they don't stop doing what they're doing and if they don't let humanitarian aid in, it wasn't if you don't stop what you're doing, if you don't let humanitarian aid in the next 30 days, then, we might think about possibly, maybe, considering cutting off military aid. So in my lifetime, there has been no president, and in all of my life and all of the life of the United States, there's no president whose foreign policy has aligned with my values, ever. Right? Even the great Jimmy Carter, while president, had a terrible foreign policy in the Middle East. He's come back and called what's happening in Palestine and apartheid since then, but that was not his position while he was president. Presidents are actors of power, and they use that power to meet their goals. So whatever the case may be on the other side of this election, there will be more work to be done at the state, local, all of the levels. There will have to be continued action, continued protest. And actually what scares me is the belief that on the other side of this, people will think from one side or another that, okay, something's going to change and sort of stop and use it to look away. When in fact, what could happen in this moment if the United States comes up with a rabbit out of its hat to put in place some sort of government kind of situation that could stabilize things? All that will be is a prolonging of the continued oppression of Palestinian people, because it won't be a democratically elected government. Because the minute any democratically elected government does anything that sort of suggests they might disagree with an American policy in Palestine, that government is shut down. There have been multiple times when there could have been elections in Palestine since 2007, but the United States has worked with Israel and the Palestinian Authority to prevent those from happening because they don't think they'll like the results.
At the mosque, we had a good discussion about maybe 100 of us got together at the mosque about 6 months ago, 5 months ago, as to who we should vote for, and we're split. We're not split with the Democrats and Republicans. We're split whether we should vote or we should vote for a third-party candidate. So it's very difficult for us to vote for a candidate that is taking our dollars and sending it to bomb Muslim homes. It's very difficult for us to vote for such a person. Okay, and we're also sort of caught in this predicament that are we going to vote for someone who wants to expel us, maybe Trump? So it's a very difficult choice to make. Although a couple of the people in that room said that we at least should vote for Trump because he hasn't bombed us yet. He has. That's a great standard to have. If you have not bombed us, we're going to vote for you. It's just really, really bad. And so the 30 days, we just perceive it as being cynical. It's just an attempt to get the 30 days. In other words, you have 30 days to fix what you're doing. Otherwise, we're going to stop aid to you. Possibly. That's just a ruse to get the votes in Michigan. That's what we think. I don't know. But I don't think there's going to be any difference. And exactly what Richard said, I'm not sure why more people don't talk about this, but 1 week after October 7th, there was a plan to relocate everybody from Gaza, right? To push everybody out. Jordan was supposed to take in certain refugees. Egyptians were to take, all of the Muslim countries were to take. Because of the backlash and the protest of you standing up and speaking up and everything being live streamed and TikTok and social media, that placed the pressure. So we're already successful. We have already, the fact that we still have a Gaza, the fact that there are still Palestinians there means that it worked. So don't give up hope. Don't become despondent, because they really wanted to exterminate and cleanse people.
Take another.
I remember seeing a survey that was done in early October, before the 7th last year. And support for a two-state solution was the dominant attitude of Palestinians in both the West Bank and Gaza. But I have seen recent polling in Israel shows that support for a two-state solution is now a minority opinion. Minority is shrinking. It still supports a two-state solution. So what can Americans or the U.S. government do to change the direction of attitudes towards a two-state solution? Or should we consider a one-state solution acceptable if it changed the nature of the state of Israel? What are people thinking about the goal, the positive direction where we're going, and who the allies are in Gaza and West Bank and Israel that would want the better solution that respects human rights and the equal dignity of all people?
I don't want to hog that time, but there's never been a viable two-state solution on the table. The Oslo Accords was never a two-state solution. It was a limited autonomy to Palestinians in two areas. There's not ever been a two-state solution on the table. And even if there were, it's not viable. These two governments are, or these two territories are so fully separated from one another that the cost of securing the borders, the cost of connecting the two groups together, is unsustainable. So I don't see the practicality of it, even if I could hope for that kind of possibility if Palestinians want it. I will say that when I was in, I spent 2 weeks in Israel, Palestine, a couple summers ago. And there was an Israeli, one of the folks who'd been on some of the negotiation teams. And he said, we don't want a one-state solution. We want a two-state solution, but we don't want it on their terms. And that's not a negotiating position. You can't, that's not how that works. And I heard that over and over and over again. We want a two-state solution, but not on their terms. We don't want a one-state solution, but we're not willing to do anything to make a two-state solution happen. And that's the reality of the position 2 years ago before this current wave of violence. And it's just gotten worse. You know, I think that I don't see a way out. I don't see a way out from where we are right now towards a two-state solution. I think there could be possibilities for a one-state solution, but it would have to be enforced through probably some form of UN arbitration with UN troops stationed from the top to the bottom. And I don't know that there's any international will for that, and I don't know how that's even practicable at this stage. But a one-state solution that's democratic, I could see value in that. But for those who are particularly from the Zionist position, that would mean the end of a Jewish state, because it's it would no longer be the majority, like Jews would no longer make up the majority of the population. And that's fundamentally at the heart of the Zionist political ideology, is a Jewish state that places Jewish identity, however it's being defined within that Zionist political movement in the time. That is not the only definition of Judaism that exists, but that version demands Jewish supremacy in the state. And so I don't know how we get away from that point.
If I may add to that, was one step removed from the 93 Oslo Accords. My then primary instructor was at those accords. And the long-term goal was eventually to get to a two-state solution at that time through a series of what were then called confidence-building measures. And one of those measures was eventually to stop settlement expansion. But frequently, the Israeli delegation would arrive for negotiation, authorized only to negotiate the next time, place of the next meeting. There was no substantial negotiation coming from the Israeli side at that time. And that dream pretty much disappeared with the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and later with the assassination of Yasser Arafat. And since then, settler expansion has continued, because even those accords stated that the situation on the ground at the time that topic came to negotiation is what would be dealt with as the reality. So if you keep postponing that decision and keep expanding, you have no reason to come to a decision if no one is stopping you from expanding. I don't know if that helps clarify the situation, but to me that is, how do I put it, something that's always been significant.
I recommend War of Redemption. It's an excellent documentary on Messianic Jews, which would never allow war. And then there'll be so War of Redemption is an excellent.
What potential is there for this war to spill over into other Middle Eastern states?
It already has. So right now there is an ongoing invasion into southern Lebanon. There have been ongoing attacks into Syria. one of the first things that caused like the back and forth direct engagement between Israel and Iran was Israel's bombing of Iranian territory in Damascus when they bombed the Israeli consulate. And that resulted in like a largely for display drone response a few months ago. It's all starting to blur how many months ago it was. So they're already being drawn in. What's been concerning, I saw the other day even, was the idea that Israel, well, the US government came out and said that they talked to Israel, they talked to Netanyahu's office, and they had agreed that Israel would not attack when it attacks Iran, that it would not attack nuclear sites, that it would stick to military installations. And then within an hour, the Israeli government said, we'll take American views into advisement, but we're going to do what we want to do, essentially. So Iran has already been drawn in, and has, for a government that I don't particularly care for, has shown remarkable restraints to date in terms of what it can and can't do in terms of response. They destroyed multiple military installations in Israel. That hasn't really been making the news because Israel has really wanted to keep that as quiet as possible. Like their internal military censorship has kept that as quiet as possible. But they've destroyed the ballistic response from a couple of weeks ago, destroyed many military installations in Israel. So Israel's response, I anticipate, will be a pretty serious one. But what I'm saying is they're already involved. Lebanon, it will collapse under the continued barrage. That government has not been strong ever, but it's been particularly weak for the last couple of decades. Syria is basically non-functional as a government. And so this does create an opening for all kinds of chaos if Lebanon collapses. And Jordan is barely holding it together. There have been protests in the streets almost every night in Jordan and Amman. And half of Jordan's population, or if not more, is of Palestinian origin. So these are their family members in the West Bank who've been attacked. It's tenuous. It's already underway.
So in Egypt, my good friends are in Egypt, protests in Egypt. So these regimes are not popular with the people. So there's domestic pressure there too, even in a tyrannical state. But the other country to keep track of